There is something your brain has been doing every single time you try to change your life. Every time you sit down to figure it out, to plan it out, to think your way into a different version of yourself. It has been locking the old version tighter. Not because you are doing something wrong, not because you lack intelligence or discipline or desire, but because the very act of thinking about your life from inside the patterns that built it cannot produce anything other than a more sophisticated version of those same patterns. You've been using the instrument that created the problem to solve the problem, and the instrument doesn't know it's doing this. It just keeps firing. It keeps generating thoughts that feel like progress, feel like insight, feel like you're finally getting somewhere. While the neural architecture underneath stays exactly the same, reinforced with every repetition, deepened with every loop, made more permanent with every attempt to think your way out of it. Today, you stop thinking. Today, you watch. And I want you to understand something before we go any further. This is not a suggestion to stop being intelligent. This is not an invitation to become passive or vacant or spiritually detached from your own life. What is being offered here is something far more precise than that. It is the recognition that there is a position available to you, a position your brain almost never occupies, from which the entire pattern of your life becomes visible. Not as something to analyze, not as something to fix, but as something to see. And the moment you truly see it, not think about it, not interpret it, not run it through the same neural filters that built it. The moment you actually watch it with clear, unobstructed awareness, it begins to change. Not because you forced it, not because you finally figured out the right strategy, but because observation at the most fundamental level of how reality works is itself a transformative act. That's not belief, that's quantum mechanics. But let's start closer to home. Let's start with what's actually happening in your brain right now, in this moment, as you listen to these words. Your brain is not a neutral processing machine, it is a prediction engine. A highly sophisticated, constantly running system whose primary job is not to perceive reality accurately, but to predict it efficiently. Right now, as you sit here, your brain is not waiting to see what happens next. It has already decided. It has already run the calculation based on everything that has happened before, matched the current environment to its stored patterns, and generated a prediction about what this moment means, what you should feel, and what you should do. By the time a thought reaches your conscious awareness, your brain has already been processing for a fraction of a second. By the time you believe you're making a decision, the neural cascade that produced that decision has already been firing. You are, in the most literal neurological sense, living slightly behind your own brain, reacting to a reality your nervous system already decided on before you had a chance to watch. This is not a flaw, it is an extraordinary efficiency for survival, for navigation, for managing the overwhelming complexity of physical existence. This predictive system is a masterpiece. But here's what that masterpiece costs you. It means that every time you try to think your way into a new life, you are thinking from inside a prediction. You are using a brain that has already decided what is possible, what you are capable of, who you are, and what your life means. And then generating thoughts that feel like exploration, but are actually confirmation. The brain is not looking for new answers. It is looking for evidence that its old answers were right. Look closer. Every morning when you wake up, and your mind immediately begins running the familiar loop, the concerns, the plans, the same recurring thoughts about the same recurring situations. That is not your mind working on your life. That is your brain running its prediction program. Every time you feel the familiar emotional contraction around a specific area of your life, the relationship, the finances, the career, the health, that contraction is not a signal about reality. It is a signal that your nervous system has already categorized that area as dangerous, as fixed, as something to manage rather than something to watch. And the moment you begin thinking about that area, you are thinking from inside the contraction. The thoughts you generate will be shaped by the fear that produced them. The solutions you devise will carry the emotional signature of the problem. You will work harder and harder inside a closed loop, and the loop will get tighter. This is why the most intelligent people are sometimes the most stuck. Not because intelligence is a liability, but because intelligence deployed inside a closed pattern simply makes the pattern more elaborate, more justified, more defended, more sophisticated in its self-reinforcement. You can think your way into extraordinary complexity and still be living the same life you were living 5 years ago, just with better reasons for why it hasn't changed. The rewire doesn't start when you figure it out. It starts the moment you stop and watch. Now here is where the science becomes precise. And I want you to stay with this, because what neuroscience has discovered about how the brain actually changes is not what most people have been told. The brain changes through a process called neuroplasticity, the ability of neural tissue to reorganize itself, to form new connections, to weaken old pathways and strengthen new ones. This is real. This is measurable. This is not metaphor. But here is what almost no one tells you about how neuroplasticity actually works, about what actually triggers the rewire. It is not triggered by more thinking, it is triggered by observation. When you are thinking, when you are inside a thought, identified with it, running it forward, building on it, reacting to it, your brain is reinforcing the neural circuit that produced that thought. Every time a circuit fires, it gets stronger. Every time you run the familiar thought loop, you are literally deepening the neural pathway, carving it deeper into the architecture of your brain. This is why repeated thoughts begin feeling like facts. This is why emotional patterns that have been practiced long enough stop feeling like patterns and start feeling like personality. The brain has fired these circuits so many times that they have become automatic. They fire before you choose. They fire before you're aware. And then you experience the output, the thought, the feeling, the reaction, and you believe you are experiencing reality. But watch what happens when you stop identifying with the thought and begin observing it. When awareness enters the system, not more thinking, not analysis, not interpretation, but clean, undirected observation, something neurologically extraordinary occurs. The circuit that was firing begins to lose its automatic authority. The thought arises, but you are not immediately inside it. The emotion surfaces, but it does not immediately control behavior. There is a gap, a space, a moment between stimulus and response that did not exist before. And in that space, the brain is no longer simply reinforcing the old pattern. It is doing something different. It is noticing the pattern. And a brain that is noticing a pattern is no longer fully captured by it. This is the beginning of the rewire. Not a decision to change, not a plan to be different. The simple, radical act of watching what the brain is doing, without immediately becoming what it's doing. Neuroscientists have documented this. When a person develops the capacity to observe their own mental processes, to watch thoughts arise without immediately identifying with them, to notice emotional states without being consumed by them, The prefrontal cortex, the region associated with executive awareness and conscious choice, begins to exert greater influence over the amygdala, the region associated with fear responses and automatic reactions. The nervous system literally reorganizes around the capacity to observe. The architecture of the brain shifts to support a different kind of engagement with reality, not reactive, witnessing. And here's where it gets precise in a way that changes everything. Because when the observer changes, the reality the observer interacts with begins to change too. This is not philosophy. This is not wishful thinking. This is the intersection of neuroscience and the most fundamental principle in quantum physics. In quantum mechanics, the observer effect is one of the most well-documented and least understood phenomena in modern science. Before a quantum particle is observed, it does not have a single definite state. It exists as a superposition, a field of probabilities. All possible states simultaneously present, none of them collapsed into actuality. The moment observation occurs, the superposition collapses. The probability field resolves into a specific, measurable event. The observer does not merely record what is happening. The observer participates in determining what happens. Now, the leap from quantum particles to human consciousness is not a simple one, and anyone who tells you it is oversimplifying. But the principle embedded in this phenomenon carries something worth watching carefully. The state of the observer matters. The quality of the observation matters. What you bring to the act of seeing shapes what becomes visible. And in the context of the brain, in the context of a nervous system that is either locked in predictive reaction or open in clear observation, this principle has a direct and measurable application. A brain wired for fear collapses possibilities connected to fear. It literally cannot perceive what falls outside the frequency of its prediction. A brain in the observer state, calm, aware, present, watching without the urgency to control or fix, interacts with the field of potential outcomes from a fundamentally different position. And from that position, different possibilities become visible, different choices become available, different futures become accessible. The observer is the most powerful position in the universe. Not because it controls, because it sees clearly. And clarity is the only force that transforms without resistance. If this is landing for you, if something in you is already beginning to shift, take a second to like this video and subscribe, because what we explore on this channel goes deeper every time, and you'll want to be here for what comes next. Pause here. This is not a thought exercise. This is an observation. I want you to do something right now, not later, not after you've finished listening. Right now, in this moment, as these words move through you, I want you to watch your thoughts. Not think new thoughts, not analyze the thoughts you're having. Simply watch them. Notice that thoughts are arising. Notice that there is something, some awareness, that is watching them arise. Notice that the awareness watching the thoughts is not itself a thought. It is the space in which thoughts appear. It is the witness. It is the observer. Stay there for a moment. Don't rush past this. The thought will try to pull you back in. It will generate commentary on the observation. It will say, I'm doing this right, or I don't understand what this means, or this is interesting, or this is uncomfortable. Watch that too. Watch the mind's attempt to think its way into the observer state. Notice that the mind cannot think its way into the observer state because the observer state is not a thought. It is what watches thoughts. Who is watching right now? Not what are you thinking, who is watching? Sit with that. Because what you just touched, even for a fraction of a second, is the position from which your brain begins to rewire. Not from effort, from seeing. Let me show you something. There is a story I want to tell you, and I want you to watch it carefully, because it is your story wearing different clothes. There was a man named Elias who had spent the better part of his adult life trying to solve himself. He was intelligent, genuinely, precisely intelligent. And he had applied that intelligence to the problem of his own unhappiness with the same rigor he applied to everything else. He had read the books, he had understood the frameworks, he could explain, with remarkable clarity, exactly why he was the way he was. He knew about his childhood patterns. He understood his attachment style. He could trace the lineage of his anxiety back through 3 generations of his family. He had done the work, as people say. He had thought about it deeply, analyzed it thoroughly, mapped it completely. And he was still unhappy, still reactive, still waking up every morning with the same low-grade dread that had been his companion for as long as he could remember. Still finding himself in the same arguments, the same disappointments, the same quiet sense that the life he was living was somehow adjacent to the life he was supposed to be living, but could never quite reach. He had a therapist, he had a journal, he had a morning routine that he had refined over years, and none of it had changed the fundamental texture of his experience. He was more articulate about his unhappiness than almost anyone he knew. He just couldn't stop being unhappy. One evening, sitting in his apartment, after a day that had gone exactly the way he had predicted it would go, because his brain had made sure of that, he noticed something. He was not noticing it on purpose. He was just sitting, too tired to think, too exhausted to analyze, and in that exhaustion, something happened. He watched a thought arise. Not a new thought. The same thought he had been having for years. The thought about how his life wasn't what it should be. About how something was fundamentally wrong. About how he was missing something that other people seemed to have. He had thought this thought 10,000 times. He had analyzed it, argued with it, agreed with it, tried to replace it with better thoughts. But this time, in the stillness of his exhaustion, he simply watched it. He watched it arise. He watched it move through his awareness. He watched the familiar tightening in his chest that always accompanied it. He watched the secondary thoughts that came rushing in to confirm it. He watched all of it, and for the first time, he noticed something he had never noticed before. He noticed that the thought was not him. It was something happening in him, something his brain was generating the way his heart generated a heartbeat automatically, without his choosing it. The thought was not a verdict, it was a pattern. A deeply worn neural groove that his brain had been running for so long that it had started to feel like reality. He didn't try to change it. He didn't analyze what it meant that he was seeing it differently now. He just watched. And in the watching, something shifted. Not dramatically, not with a sudden feeling of liberation or clarity, just a subtle but unmistakable loosening. The thought lost a fraction of its authority. The tightening in his chest was still there, but it was no longer pulling him under. He was watching it from a position that was somehow slightly outside of it. He sat there for a long time, just watching. The next morning, he woke up with the same dread. But now he watched it. He watched it arise before he was fully awake. He watched his brain begin its familiar predictive loop. He watched the thoughts begin generating, the plans and concerns and interpretations and defenses, and he watched himself watch all of it. And something continued to loosen. He had not figured anything out. He had not solved anything. He had not replaced the old patterns with new ones through effort or discipline or the application of better thinking. He had simply begun to watch. And in the watching, the patterns that had controlled his life for decades began to lose their grip. Not all at once, not without resistance, but unmistakably, irreversibly, they began to change. Because what you watch, you change, and what you've been avoiding watching, the pattern itself, the raw mechanical fact of it, not its meaning or its origin or its solution, but simply the pattern as pattern, has been running your life precisely because you've been too busy thinking about it to see it. And you have been both Elias and the thought he was trapped inside. You have been the one who analyzes and the one who avoids, and the one who, in moments of exhaustion or grace, suddenly watches. Today, you are choosing to watch. Tell me something in the comments. What is the specific pattern you just saw yourself in as you listened to that story? Not what you think about it, what you actually saw. The precise shape of the loop you recognized as yours. Name it. Because naming what you have genuinely observed is itself an act of watching, and it matters. Let's go deeper into what you're actually seeing. Here is the layer that most conversations about neuroplasticity and brain change completely miss. They tell you the brain can change. They tell you that new neural pathways can form, that old ones can weaken, that you are not permanently fixed by your past. All of this is true. But they almost never tell you what actually initiates the change at the deepest level. They give you tools, meditation, journaling, visualization, affirmations, breath work, cold exposure, therapy. These are all valid. These are all useful. But they are useful not because of the specific technique, but because of what happens when any of these techniques is practiced with genuine observation rather than effortful thinking. The common thread is not the tool, it is the quality of attention brought to the tool, and that quality has a name. It is the observer state. The observer state is not a feeling. It is not a mood or an emotion or a spiritual achievement. It is a neurological position. It is the position your brain occupies when it is watching its own processes, rather than being captured by them. When the prefrontal cortex is actively engaged in witnessing, rather than reacting, when the nervous system is regulated enough that it is not in survival mode, not scanning for threat, not generating the emergency chemistry that narrows perception and locks in automatic response. In the observer state, the brain is doing something it almost never gets to do in ordinary life. It is watching itself. And a brain that watches itself is a brain that can change itself. This is why the most powerful practices are not the most effortful ones. They are the ones that cultivate the capacity to watch. Meditation does not work because it relaxes you, though it does that. It works because it trains the brain to observe its own activity without immediately reacting to it. Therapy does not work because someone gives you better explanations for your behavior, though that can help. It works when something in the therapeutic relationship creates enough safety that you can watch your own patterns arise without the defensive urgency to protect yourself from seeing them. Breathwork does not work because of the biochemistry of breathing, though that is real. It works because it gives the nervous system something to observe, the breath, that is neutral enough and immediate enough to anchor the observer position when the mind would otherwise be swept away by its own currents. The tool is a vehicle for the observer. The observer is the agent of change. Everything else is scaffolding, but here's what happens when you try to use these tools without the observer state. When you meditate while thinking about whether you're meditating correctly. When you journal while performing insight for yourself. Writing what you think you should be discovering rather than watching what is actually there. When you do breath work while monitoring whether you're having the right experience. When you use any practice as a sophisticated form of thinking rather than as an invitation to stop thinking and watch. The tool becomes another loop, another way of applying the old neural pattern to the project of change, more elaborate, more decorated, but still the same closed circuit. You've been doing this. Be honest. You know the practices, you've tried them, and there have been moments, genuine, unmistakable moments where something shifted, where you touched the observer state, where the pattern became visible and lost its authority, and you felt the possibility of genuine change, and then the mind came back in. The thinking started again, the analysis, the interpretation, the monitoring of progress, the comparison to where you should be, the doubt, the hope, the planning, and the observer state dissolved. And you are back inside the pattern, now with slightly more sophisticated language for why you are still stuck. This is not a failure. This is what brains do. The mind's job is to think. It will always try to think its way back into control because that is what it has been trained to do. Because that is what has kept you alive and functional. The mind is not your enemy, but it is not your guide into the observer state. You cannot think your way into watching. You can only watch. Look closer. There is something specific you have been avoiding looking at, not in general, not as a category of difficulty or challenge. Something specific. A particular area of your life where your attention goes and then immediately deflects. Where you begin to look and then your mind generates a thought, a plan, a justification, a distraction, an interpretation that pulls you out of direct seeing and back into the familiar management of the thing you were about to see clearly. You know what it is. You've known for a long time. The fact that your mind is already generating a list of candidates, already beginning to analyze which one it might be, already preparing a thoughtful response to this prompt. Watch that. Watch the mind's immediate move to think about what it might be rather than simply looking at what is there. Because here's the truth about what you've been avoiding. It is not as dangerous as you've been treating it. The avoidance is more costly than the seeing, the energy required to not look at something, to keep it just outside the field of direct awareness, to generate enough mental noise that you never have to be still with it, to stay busy enough that it never surfaces into clear light. That energy is enormous. It is draining you. It is part of what makes the familiar exhaustion, the low-grade depletion, the sense that you are working very hard and not quite arriving anywhere. You are spending a significant portion of your available life force on the project of not seeing something. And the moment you look, the moment you bring the observer state to bear on exactly this thing, it begins to change. Not because looking at it gives you a solution, not because seeing it clearly tells you what to do, but because the pattern that has been running in the dark, running on the energy of your avoidance, running on the automatic neural circuits that fire every time this area of your life comes into proximity with your awareness. That pattern cannot survive direct, sustained, clear observation. It evolved in the dark. It was maintained by the dark. The moment you shine the clean light of genuine watching on it, it begins to dissolve. Not because you defeated it, because you saw it. And what has been seen cannot unsee itself. Here is the layer underneath that. Your brain has a very specific relationship with uncertainty. For most of your life, uncertainty has been treated by your nervous system as a form of danger. The unknown has triggered the same survival response as an actual threat. The stress hormones, the narrowed perception, the urgent need to resolve, to control, to predict, to make the uncertain certain as quickly as possible. This is why you default to thinking when you feel uncertain. Thinking feels like doing something about the uncertainty. It feels like moving toward resolution. It feels like control. Even when the thinking is circular, even when it is generating the same thoughts it generated yesterday and the day before, it feels more tolerable than simply watching the uncertainty without trying to resolve it. But here's what that response costs you. It costs you access to the very information the uncertainty contains. Because uncertainty shows genuine, unresolved, open uncertainty is not a problem to be solved. It is a field. It is the space in which new possibilities exist before they collapse into specific form. And when you rush to resolve it through thinking, when you force the uncertain into the familiar shape of what you already know, you collapse that field prematurely. You take a quantum probability space full of possibilities that your current brain cannot yet see, and you force it into the shape of your existing neural architecture. You make the new into the old every time. The observer state changes this. When you bring clean, undefended watching to uncertainty, when you can be present with not knowing without immediately generating thoughts to make the not knowing feel safer, something remarkable becomes available. The nervous system, no longer in emergency mode, no longer burning its resources on the project of premature resolution, begins to settle. And in that settling, in that quiet that opens when you stop trying to think your way out of the unknown, the field of possibility remains open longer. New connections become available. Intuitions arise that could not have arisen inside the noise of anxious thinking. Clarity appears not as the result of more analysis, but as a natural emergence from sustained, patient watching. This is not mysticism. This is what happens when a regulated nervous system, no longer locked in survival response, is allowed to process information from a broader, more integrated state. The brain in the observer state has access to more of itself. The prefrontal cortex is online. The default mode network, which is responsible for creative connection-making and self-referential processing, can function without being hijacked by the amygdala's emergency signals. The brain literally thinks better, more creatively, more expansively, more accurately, when it is watching rather than reacting. But more than thinking better, it perceives differently. And perception is where everything begins. Let's go deeper into what perception actually is, because you have been told your whole life that you perceive reality, that your senses take in information from the world and your brain processes it and you experience what is actually there. This is not what happens. What actually happens is this: your brain receives an enormous amount of sensory data every second, far more than it can process consciously, and it filters that data through its existing neural architecture. It selects what is relevant based on what it has learned to expect, what it has been trained to prioritize, what matches its existing predictions about what the world is and what your place in it is. Everything that doesn't match the prediction gets filtered out before it reaches conscious awareness. You never see it. It was there. You didn't see it, not because it wasn't real, but because your brain decided in advance that it wasn't relevant. This means that the reality you experience is not the reality that exists. It is a reality that your neural architecture is configured to perceive. And it means that when your neural architecture changes, when the brain rewires itself around a different observer state, you begin perceiving a genuinely different reality. Not a different interpretation of the same reality, a different reality. Different information reaches conscious awareness. Different possibilities become visible. Different connections become available. The world is not different, but your perception of it is so fundamentally transformed that the practical effect is identical to the world being different. This is what people mean when they describe major life transformations as feeling like waking up. They are not being poetic, they are describing something neurologically accurate. The brain that was filtering reality through fear and survival, and the predictive patterns of a wounded identity, was literally not seeing what was there. And when that brain rewires, when the observer state becomes the dominant position rather than the reactive state, it is as if lights have been turned on in a room that has been dark for years. The room was always there. The possibilities were always there. You simply could not see them from the position you are occupying. Now watch this carefully, because this is where the quantum mechanics becomes personal. If your brain's current wiring determines what you perceive, and what you perceive determines what you can choose, and what you choose determines the trajectory of your life, then the most important change you can make is not in your actions, it is in your perception. And the most direct route to changing your perception is not through new information or better thinking or more sophisticated strategies. It is through changing the state of the observer, because the observer's state determines the filter. The filter determines what is visible, and what is visible determines everything else. You have been trying to change your actions while leaving the observer unchanged. You have been trying to make different choices while the brain generating those choices is still operating from the same predictive architecture. You have been trying to create a new life while the observer who is creating it is still looking through the lens of the old one. This is why effort without observer change produces the same results with more exhaustion. This is why you can work incredibly hard and feel like you are going in circles. Because you are. The circle is the neural architecture. And the neural architecture does not change through more effort inside the circle. It changes when the observer steps outside the circle and watches it. Pause here. This is not a thought exercise. This is an observation. I want you to bring your attention to something specific right now. Think of an area of your life where you have been working hard without the results you expected, where you have been applying effort, intelligence, strategy, and the situation has remained essentially the same or changed more slowly than the effort should have produced. Don't analyze it. Don't try to figure out why. Just bring it to mind and watch what happens in your body when you do. Notice the sensation. Notice where in your body you feel it. Notice whether it is tightness or heaviness, or a kind of deflation or a particular quality of tension. Don't interpret it. Don't try to make it mean something. Just watch it. Notice that there is an awareness present that can feel this sensation without being destroyed by it. Notice that you can be with the feeling of the stuck area without the feeling taking over. Now watch the thoughts that arise around it. the explanations, the self-criticism or the external blame, the plans and the doubts about the plans. Watch all of it arise without following any of it. Stay in the position of the watcher, the one who sees the sensation, sees the thoughts, sees the whole pattern, and is not identical to any of it. This is the observer state. This is the position from which your brain can actually change. Not because you figured out the right answer about this stuck area, but because you are, right now, watching it from outside the loop rather than thinking from inside it. And every second you spend in this position, something in the neural architecture is shifting. The automatic authority of the pattern is being interrupted. The circuit that fires this pattern is firing without being immediately reinforced by your identification with it. And without reinforcement, circuits weaken. Without reinforcement, space opens, and in that space, the possibility of something genuinely new becomes available. Stay with this for a moment. Don't rush past what you just saw. And when you come back to the comments after this, I want to know about a moment when you finally watched something long enough to understand it, not analyzed it, watched it. The moment a pattern revealed its own mechanic simply because you stayed present with it without looking away. Share that in the comments. Because what you name in the presence of others, you see more clearly than what you name alone. Now let me show you the next layer. Because there is something that happens during the rewire, during the period when the old neural architecture is genuinely dissolving and the new one has not yet fully formed, that almost everyone misunderstands. And the misunderstanding causes people to stop the process right at the moment when it is working most powerfully. There's a stage in neuroplastic transformation that feels like loss. It feels like confusion. It feels like you are becoming less yourself rather than more. The motivations that used to drive you begin losing their force. Goals that once felt urgent begin feeling strangely irrelevant. Relationships and situations that used to define your identity begin feeling unfamiliar, as though you are watching them from a slight distance, as though the person who cared so intensely about these things is beginning to recede. Your internal dialogue changes. The voice that used to narrate your life with such authority begins sounding different, quieter, less certain, sometimes almost absent. And the mind, which is still trying to think its way through everything, interprets this as a problem. It generates thoughts like, something is wrong with me. I'm losing my motivation. I'm becoming disconnected. I'm depressed. I'm falling apart. I need to get back to who I was. And then it begins trying to rebuild the old identity, to reignite the old drives, to return to the familiar patterns, because the familiar patterns, however painful, felt like self. And the unfamiliar quiet feels like nothing, feels like absence, feels like loss. But look closer. What is actually happening in this stage is not loss, it is synaptic pruning. The brain is removing neural connections that are no longer being used, connections that were built around the old identity, around the fear-based drives, the survival-motivated goals, the emotional patterns that defined who you were, are losing their structural integrity as the brain stops reinforcing them. This is not a psychological crisis, it is a neurological renovation. The old architecture is being cleared to make room for the new one, and it feels like emptiness, because the old furniture is gone and the new furniture hasn't arrived yet. The people who make it through this stage, who allow the renovation to complete rather than rushing back to rebuild the old structure are the ones who discover that the quiet on the other side of the dissolution is not emptiness. It is space. It is the felt sense of a nervous system that is no longer spending all of its resources on maintaining a defensive identity. It is the experience of being present without the constant noise of a brain that is trying to protect and justify and explain a version of self that was never truly who you are. But you have to watch this stage rather than think your way out of it. You have to be willing to be in the uncertainty of the renovation without immediately rebuilding the old structure. You have to be willing to not know who you are for a period of time, to watch the old identity dissolve without gripping it, to trust that what comes after the dissolution is not nothing, but something more real than what dissolved. This requires a particular kind of courage, not the courage of action, the courage of observation. The willingness to watch something that feels like loss and not look away. The willingness to stay present with the uncertainty without rushing to resolve it into something familiar. The willingness to be the observer even when what is being observed is the dissolution of everything you thought you were. And here's what no one tells you about this stage: the dissolution is not happening to you, it is happening through you. You are not being taken apart by some external force. The awareness that is watching the dissolution is the same awareness that initiated it. The observer in you, the part that decided to look, that chose to stop reacting and start watching, is the part that is doing the rewiring. The dissolution is not loss, it is the observer reclaiming the territory that the old patterns had occupied. It is consciousness expanding back into the space that fear had contracted it away from. You were never the pattern. You were always the one watching it. The rewire is not creating something new. It is revealing what was always there, underneath the noise, underneath the prediction, underneath the defended identity that your brain built to keep you safe in a world it had decided was dangerous. Let me show you one more story. Watch this carefully. There was a woman named Mira who had spent years building a life she thought she wanted. She had the career she had worked toward, the relationship she had chosen deliberately, the apartment that reflected the person she believed herself to be. From the outside, it looked assembled, intentional, like someone who knew what they were doing, and she had thought her way into every piece of it. Every decision had been analyzed. Every choice had been weighed. She had applied her considerable intelligence to the construction of her life the way an architect applies intelligence to a building. With precision, with foresight, with an understanding of how the pieces fit together. And she was not happy. She was not miserable. She was something worse than miserable. She was fine. She was functioning. She was achieving. And underneath all of it, there was a persistent, quiet sense that she was watching her life from behind glass. That she was present for it in the way you are present for something you are managing, rather than something you are living. That the self who had built all of this was a very good construction, intelligent, capable, admirably put together, but not quite real, not quite her. She didn't know what to do with this, because there was nothing wrong. She had thought about it from every angle and found no structural flaw. The life she had built was the life she had planned to build. The problem, if it was a problem, had no logical solution because it had no logical cause. It was not a problem that could be solved by thinking. One afternoon, sitting in a meeting she had organized about a project she had initiated in pursuit of a goal she had set, she noticed that she was not there. Not literally, she was physically present, saying the right things, performing the role of the person who had built this life. But the awareness that was watching all of this was somewhere else, watching from a distance, watching herself perform herself. And for just a moment, instead of pulling her attention back into the performance, she stayed in the watching position. She watched herself in the meeting. She watched the thoughts she was generating. She watched the face she was presenting and the one she was concealing. She watched all of it with a strange, calm, almost clinical clarity. And in that watching, something became visible that had never been visible before. She saw the construction, not abstractly. She had known abstractly for years that she had constructed her identity. She saw it specifically. She saw the precise shape of the defended self she had built. She saw the fear underneath it, the specific, particular fear that had driven every decision, that had shaped every choice, that had built every piece of this life she was managing rather than living. She saw it clearly, without flinch, without the usual rush to explain it or justify it or fix it. She just watched it. And in the watching, the construction began to feel different. Not wrong, not something to be torn down, but visible. And a construction that is fully visible is no longer a prison. It is a choice. She could see for the first time the difference between who she was and what she had built. She could see the observer, the one who was watching, and she could see that the observer was not the construction. The observer was what had been there before the construction began. What had been there underneath all the thinking and planning and building. The real thing, the one who watched. She did not leave the meeting and tear her life apart. She did not make a dramatic decision or take a radical action. She simply continued watching. And over the following months, as she continued watching, as she brought the observer state to bear on her life with increasing consistency, with increasing willingness to see without flinching, things began to change. Not because she forced them, because the construction, seen clearly, began reorganizing itself around the observer rather than around the fear that had built it. The life she had built began becoming, slowly and unmistakably, the life she actually wanted to live. Not because the circumstances changed dramatically, because the one living the circumstances had changed. The observer had come forward, and reality had no choice but to respond. And you have been both the architect and the one behind the glass. You have been building and managing and thinking and constructing. And somewhere underneath all of it, the observer has been waiting for you to stop thinking long enough to watch, waiting for you to be still enough that what is actually there can become visible. Today you are choosing to watch, and what you watch, you change. Now let's go into the deepest layer, the one that applies all of this directly to where you are right now. You have a specific version of your life that you have been trying to change. You have applied effort to it. You have applied thinking to it. You have applied strategies and intentions and perhaps prayers and perhaps despair. And the thing that has not changed, the specific, persistent, stubborn thing that remains the same regardless of your effort, is not remaining the same because it is too strong for you. It is remaining the same because you have not yet watched it clearly enough for long enough from the observer position. Every time you approach it, your brain does one of several things. It generates urgency. the feeling that you need to act, to fix, to do something about this right now, which pulls you out of observation and into reaction. Or it generates overwhelm, the feeling that this is too big, too complex, too deeply rooted to be addressed, which produces the avoidance that keeps the pattern running in the dark. Or it generates a plan, a new strategy, a new approach, a new version of the thinking you've already applied, which feels like progress but is actually the closed loop tightening. Or it generates despair, the thought that this will never change, that you are somehow fundamentally broken or limited in this area, which is perhaps the most sophisticated form of avoidance because it dresses the refusal to look as a conclusion about what looking would reveal. Watch all of these. Watch the urgency. Watch the overwhelm. Watch the planning. Watch the despair. Watch them as what they are. Neural patterns, automatic responses, the brain's attempt to manage the thing rather than see it. And then from the observer position, look at the thing itself. Not at your thoughts about it, not at your feelings about your thoughts about it. The thing itself, the raw, uninterpreted pattern, the behavior or the belief or the emotional state or the relationship dynamic or the recurring situation that has been present in your life regardless of your efforts to change it. Look at it the way you would look at a weather system, not as something you caused or deserve or need to fix, as something that is there, as a pattern with a structure, as something that, when seen clearly, reveals its own mechanics. Watch it without the urgency to make it stop. Watch it without the despair that says it will never stop. Watch it with the clean, steady, undefended attention of the observer who knows that what is watched is already beginning to change. This is the practice, not a technique, not a tool. The practice of watching, of bringing the observer state to the specific thing you have been avoiding seeing clearly, of staying in that position long enough that the pattern loses its automatic authority, of trusting that the act of watching is itself the transformation, not a step toward transformation, not a preparation for transformation, but the thing itself. The rewire beginning in real time, the neural architecture shifting under the influence of clean, sustained observation. Here's what you will notice as this practice deepens. The first thing you will notice is that the thoughts about the thing become more visible. You will see them arising more clearly. The interpretations, the judgments, the stories, the explanations. You will see them as thoughts rather than as reality. This is the beginning of the space between stimulus and response. This is the prefrontal cortex coming online. This is the observer state establishing itself. The second thing you will notice is that the emotional charge around the thing begins to decrease. Not because you suppressed the emotion, not because you talked yourself out of it, but because emotion that is watched, genuinely watched, without judgment, without the urgency to make it stop, metabolizes, it moves through the system, it completes its cycle. The body is extraordinarily efficient at processing emotional states when the nervous system is regulated enough to allow the processing rather than locking the emotion in through either suppression or identification. Watching creates the conditions for this. The emotion arises, is seen, is allowed to move, and releases. And the neural circuit that was generating that emotion loses a fraction of its charge each time this happens. Over time, not all at once, but measurably, undeniably over time, the pattern loses its grip. The third thing you will notice is that new information begins appearing. Not because you sought it, because you are now perceiving from a different position. The brain that was filtering reality through the lens of the old pattern was missing things, possibilities, connections, resources, perspectives that were there all along but invisible to the observer locked inside the pattern. As the observer state deepens, as the filter changes, as perception expands, you begin seeing what was always there. Opportunities that were invisible become visible. Paths that seemed closed reveal themselves as open. People appear in your life who carry exactly the quality or knowledge or connection that the new trajectory requires. This is not magic. This is what happens when a brain that was operating from a narrow, fear-filtered perception begins operating from a broader, awareness-based perception. Reality doesn't change. Your ability to see it does, and the practical effect is identical. The fourth thing you will notice, and this is the one that will most surprise you, is that the actions you take from the observer state are different from the actions you take from the reactive state. Not more effortful, less effortful, more precise, more aligned. Less driven by the urgency of fear and more guided by the clarity of genuine seeing. You will find yourself doing things that the thinking mind would not have generated, not because they are irrational, but because they are coming from a different level of perception than the level that was running before. They will feel right in a way that is deeper than logical. They will produce results that effort alone never produced, not because you got lucky, because you are acting from a different position. The observer position. The position from which reality actually responds. Watch what happens in your body when you hear this. Not the thoughts it generates, the felt sense, the place where something in you recognizes this as true before the mind has a chance to analyze it. That recognition is not wishful thinking. That is the observer in you responding to the description of its own nature. That is the part of you that has always been watching, that has never been fully captured by the pattern, that has been waiting patiently, persistently, through all the thinking and planning and efforting and managing for you to stop and look. That part of you is not small. It is not a minor feature of your consciousness. It is the most fundamental thing about you. It is the awareness in which everything else appears. The thoughts appear in it, the emotions appear in it, the identity appears in it, the story of your life appears in it, and it has been there, unchanged through all of it, watching, available, waiting for you to recognize it not as a spiritual concept, but as the most practical, most powerful, most immediately available resource you have ever had access to. You were never meant to look away. You were built for this. The capacity to observe, to step back from the stream of thought and sensation and reaction and watch it with clear, steady, undefended awareness, is not a skill you need to develop from scratch. It is not something you need to earn or achieve or deserve. It is what you are when you stop being what you've been trained to perform. It is the ground state, the default of consciousness when consciousness is not being hijacked by the noise of the predictive brain. And the brain, when it discovers this, when it gets its first genuine taste of the observer state, when it experiences the difference between the contracted, reactive, noise-filled state it has been living in and the open, aware, watching state that is available the moment the noise quiets, The brain wants to stay there, not as a concept, as a felt experience. The nervous system recognizes the observer state as home, as the condition it was designed to operate from, as the state in which it functions most efficiently, most creatively, most accurately. And it begins reorganizing itself around that state, building the neural architecture to support it, strengthening the circuits that maintain it, weakening the circuits that pull it away from it. This is the rewire, not a forced installation of new programming, a return to the most fundamental operating system, the one that was always there underneath the layers of learned reaction and defended identity and habitual thought. The one that watches, the one that sees, the one that, in seeing, transforms what it sees, not through force or effort or the application of will, but through the simple, radical, extraordinarily powerful act of looking clearly at what is actually there. Let me give you one final practice before we close. And I want you to take this seriously, not as a technique to try and evaluate, as a commitment to the observer state you have been touching throughout this transmission. Find a moment today, not later, not tomorrow, today, to sit with the specific thing you have been avoiding looking at. The thing that came to mind earlier, the area of your life where effort has not produced change, the pattern that has been running in the dark. Give it 5 minutes, not to think about it, not to plan what to do about it, to watch it, to bring the observer state to bear on it with the full force of your undivided attention. To look at it the way you would look at something you genuinely want to understand. Not to fix, not to judge, not to explain, but to see. Watch what arises. Watch the urgency to act. Watch the impulse to look away. Watch the thoughts that rush in to manage the seeing. Watch all of it. And underneath all of it, watch the pattern itself, the raw fact of it, the shape of it, the texture of it, the way it feels in your body, the way it has organized your life around it without your conscious agreement. Watch it until something shifts, not a dramatic shift, a subtle one, a slight loosening, a fractional decrease in the automatic authority the pattern has over you. A moment, even a single moment, in which you are clearly, unmistakably the observer rather than the observed. The one who watches rather than the one who is watched. That moment is the beginning of the rewire. That moment is the neural architecture beginning to change. That moment is the observer state establishing itself as the dominant position rather than the reactive state. That moment is the quantum field of your life beginning to reorganize around a different observer. And once it begins, it does not stop. Because once you have seen something clearly, you cannot unsee it. The pattern that was running in the dark cannot return to the dark once it has been seen in the light. It can try. The old circuits will fire. The familiar thoughts will arise. The habitual reactions will attempt to reassert themselves. But they will be doing so in the presence of an observer who has seen them. And that changes everything. Because what you watch, you change. What you avoid watching controls you. And the moment you stop looking away, the moment you bring the full, clear, undefended attention of the observer to the exact thing that has been running your reality, that thing loses its power. Not gradually over years, not after you've done enough work. In the moment of genuine seeing, in the quantum instant of clear observation, collapsing the probability field of your life into a new configuration. in the precise moment when the observer fully occupies its position and reality has no choice but to respond. This is what is available to you right now, not after you've figured it out, not after you've changed enough or healed enough or worked hard enough. Right now, in the position you're already in, with the awareness you already have. With the observer that has been here all along, watching, waiting, ready, the moment you stop thinking and start watching. Something in you already knows this. Something in you recognized it before your mind could catch up. Something in you has been watching for longer than you realize, waiting for this permission, waiting for this clarity, waiting for the moment when you would stop managing your life and start seeing it. That something is not a concept, it is not a spiritual aspiration. It is what you are, the observer, the one who watches, the one who, in watching, transforms. You were never meant to look away. And if this transmission found you at the right moment, if something in it cracked open a space you have been keeping closed, send it to someone who is ready to stop managing and start seeing. Not because they asked for help, because you know they are standing at the edge of something they have been afraid to look at. When you share this with them, you are not just sending a video, you are giving them permission to look. And that permission, arriving from someone who has already chosen to watch, creates something between you. A field of shared observation that makes the seeing easier for both of you. Clarity given away does not diminish. It amplifies. What you offer to another observer, you deepen in yourself. And when the noise of the day has settled, when you find yourself reacting instead of watching, when the old loops start pulling you back in, come back to this. Rewatch it from the observer position, because what you hear from inside the pattern and what you hear from inside the observer state are two different transmissions entirely. Now I want to hear from you. In the comments below, I want you to share one thing, just one, that you saw during this transmission. Not what you thought about, not what you planned to do, what you saw. The specific thing that became visible when you stopped thinking about your life and started watching it. The pattern, the avoidance, the place where effort has been substituted for observation. Share it. Not because sharing it will fix it, because saying it out loud, naming it, making it visible to another set of eyes, bringing it into the light of shared awareness, is itself an act of observation. And what is observed in the field of a community of watchers carries more clarity than what is observed alone. Type A in the comments. I see it now, and it can't unsee itself. If that landed, if something in this transmission touched the observer in you and you felt the shift, even fractionally, even for a moment, let that be your declaration, not of a belief, of a recognition. The observer recognizing itself. If this transmission gave you something, if it moved something in you, if it showed you something you had been avoiding, if it offered you a glimpse of the position from which your life can actually change, share it with someone who is ready to stop thinking and start watching. Because the observer state is contagious. Clarity spreads, and a field of observers, each one bringing their clear, undefended attention to the patterns that have been running their lives. That field is more powerful than any individual effort. That field is a collective rewire, a shared quantum collapse of the probability fields of 1,000 lives, all in the direction of genuine seeing. Stay in the observer state, not as a practice you do for 5 minutes, and then return to the noise. as the position you occupy, as the ground you return to every time the thinking mind pulls you back into its loops, as the home your nervous system is learning to recognize and inhabit. Every time you catch yourself thinking about your life instead of watching it, every time you notice the familiar urgency or overwhelm or planning or despair arising around the thing that hasn't changed, come back to the observer. Not with effort, with recognition. The observer is already there. It has always been there. You are simply choosing to occupy it. And from that position, from the clear, steady, undefended watching that is the most fundamental thing about you, your brain rewires, your perception expands, your reality reorganizes, not because you forced it, because you saw it, because the observer changed. And when the observer changes, everything the observer touches changes with it. The rewire doesn't start when you figure it out. It starts the moment you stop and watch. The observer is the most powerful position in the universe, and you are already there. You have always been there. Now you know it. Now you see it. And what has been seen cannot be unseen. The next step from here is understanding what happens the moment reality itself registers that you have changed. Watch. When you see through reality's illusion, everything changes because it picks up exactly where this transmission ends and shows you what becomes possible when the observer is no longer just watching the pattern, but watching the entire field of reality respond to a new you.